Welcome to Connects. Today we're joined by Mr. Jim Brunner, a Seattle Times reporter. He covers local, state, and regional politics. Welcome, Jim.
Hello, thank you.
Hi, so how are you doing today?
Pretty good, like most days. I'm working in my home office that I didn't expect to be a home office. There's some clutter you can see behind me because I also didn't know that the webcam I bought was like a fisheye wide angle, but it's serviceable and, staying safe in this pandemic and trying to keep doing work. There's a little bit of news out there.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for joining us today. Also joining us today are students from Open Window School, Lake Washington High School, and of course, College Place High School. Welcome, guys. All right, so without further ado, Mr. Jim, could you please briefly explain what your job is like as a reporter for us and the students here?
Well, I write for the Seattle Times. I've been there for quite a while, and I kind of specialize in politics and government. And that means elections, but it also means writing about what the government's doing, what the legislature's doing, when I can, what Congress is doing, sometimes issues related to the president, also trying to find out when government isn't doing what it should be doing. Watchdog stories are a key for us. And, and we're doing a mix of daily stories. We're updating things all the time online, of course, now. And then we still put out a print newspaper 7 days a week. So it's a busy time, and we've got a big consequential election coming up.
For sure. Wow, you have a very cool job. So let's get started with our first question from Howie from Lake Washington High School.
Hello. So my question is, what kinds of rules exist when it comes to reporting on politics, especially elections?
Hey, thanks for the question. The rules are kind of the same, I think, for all kinds of reporting, at least that we do. There are sort of formal standards that most journalists abide by, at least at mainstream publications. Society of Professional Journalists has a code of ethics. We have an internal code of ethics. So that means trying to verify information, of course, before we publish it. Sometimes you don't always know, if somebody's lobbing an allegation out there, you don't always know the truth of it. But if it's newsworthy, you sometimes report on it and you attribute the information, and then you keep digging and try to get to the truth. So, it's about verification. It's about trying to break news quickly, but it's more important to get it right. That's sort of our mantra.
Our next question comes from Kaylee.
Hi, my name is Kaylee Agers. I am a junior at College Place High School, and I was wondering if the Western opinion of Washington mattered more than the Eastern opinion of Washington, or if they both matter just as much to you.
Hey, that's a question that I get covering politics. As you know, there are more people who live on the west side of the state. I think that's what you're talking about, than on the east side of the state. I grew up in Eastern Washington, actually, or in Central Washington, Wenatchee, and I've lived in Seattle for many years now. I don't think you can say someone's opinion counts more, but when it comes to votes, there's a saying in politics that you can see all the votes you need to win a statewide race by standing at the top of the Space Needle in Seattle. That's roughly true. It's hard to win a statewide race, like for governor in Washington, if you can't be competitive in King County, which is Seattle's county. And that's sort of the problem that Republicans have had in this state for quite a while now. And it's why they actually only have 2 statewide offices that they're still elected to, Secretary of State and State Treasurer. And we'll see if they hold on to those after this year. So again, I hear a lot from people in Eastern Washington who are frustrated, and they complain, Seattle decides all the elections and they think it's unfair, but it's a one vote, one person system. That's the Constitution. And so, it's definitely frustrating. There are people in Eastern Washington who have talked for decades and even this year about trying to secede from the rest of the state, but those efforts probably aren't going anywhere. Hope that answers it.
Our next question comes from Emily from Lake Washington High School.
How does voter turnout differ in local state elections to the national elections?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. You know, every 4 years we have a presidential election, and that's when we run all our statewide offices in Washington too. And those are the years with by far the biggest turnout. So in odd years in Washington state, and it varies by state, you don't have, you know, the president on the ballot, you don't have the governor on the ballot. Those are years typically for local elections. So like in Seattle, we'll have a big mayoral election next year, and that'll drive a lot of voter turnout in Seattle. But overall, turnout in these off-year elections is probably half or less than it is in presidential elections. They're expecting maybe up to 80–90% turnout in Washington state this year. King County is, the elections director has said they'd like to see over 90%, which would set a record. And that would be, by the way, when we talk about 90%, that's of registered voters, 90% of registered voters. There are a lot of people who don't register to vote still, and so the percentage of the voting age population is much less. And of course, there are some people who aren't eligible to vote because, for example, if you've been convicted of a felony and you haven't got your voting rights restored, you can't vote in Washington state. And those rules vary by state. So presidential election years, national election years, huge turnout, lots of interest. Many people only vote in those elections, and the local elections are they just don't quite draw as many people.
All right, from Open Window, Jasper Park has our next question.
Hi, I'm Jasper Park, and I'm an 8th grader at OWS. And obviously, this is a very complex, very split presidential election. And how do you think that the complexity and division between voters at the national level will affect elections for Congress or for state government positions?
Good question. Thanks, Jasper. Thanks to all these questions. They're really good. So it's interesting. The national politics and the divided nature of it absolutely carries down the ballot to less significant or less, powerful offices, like you mentioned, I think state legislature, even Congress. So you have wave elections a lot of times. Just 2 years ago, there was a wave election for the Democrats. It wasn't the biggest wave ever, but it allowed the Democrats to take back Congress, for example. And Democrats over the last several years in the state legislature have been steadily sort of boosting their majority. They have the state House and the state Senate, and we'll see how they do this year. But some of those people who run, for example, say you're running in a legislative district in the suburbs near Seattle. This is what happens. You're a Republican, maybe you're not big on Trump, but you're a Republican and you're a moderate, for example. And so you might fit the district pretty well, but in a wave year, it might not matter. All your arguments might not matter. If people are just in the mood to turn out one party or the other, you can get swept aside in that. And that happened in 2018. It happens a lot. Republicans in this state are pretty worried about it happening this year. That being said, it kind of flips both ways. There are parts of the state that, for example, Grays Harbor County, I think, voted for Democrats for 80 years for president. And in 2016, they voted for Donald Trump. And a couple of Democratic state legislators who serve in that area are in danger this year because, that area might still be pretty pro-Trump. We'll see. I mean, I'm not saying that the local election efforts don't matter, but that you can definitely get swept out by forces larger than, anything a local candidate can deal with.
Our next question comes from Raya of Lake Washington High School.
Hi, my question is, so based off of your experiences and what you've seen so far this year, do you think we will know a clear winner of the election on November 3rd?
Good question. I think on the presidential level, it's possible, but I think one interesting thing is that in Washington State, we've gotten used to waiting to know our election results, like for governor, for example. And it's kind of a drag as a reporter on election night, and maybe especially for like the TV people, because sometimes you have to have a story that's you know voting held today. Tune in sometime later in the week to see who won. So the mail ballots in a lot more states are going to go to mail balloting this year. Are going to take longer to count, and that I think may delay the result of the presidential election. And I think that actually, I'm hoping that the national news networks behave responsibly and don't try to call the election before all the votes are in, because there's a desire to do that, and sometimes there's pressure to do that because you want to be first or to get a bunch of clicks or ratings or something. But there's nothing worse than getting it wrong, and publications and networks have gotten it wrong. So if the races are anywhere close, you won't know on election night. And I would bet, well, I don't know, I'm not going to bet on the presidential election, but we might have to wait.
All right, our next question also comes from Lake Washington High School, and it's from Lily.
Hi, my name is Lily Ulrich. I'm a senior at Lake Washington High School, and my question is, how will the pandemic impact the 2021 election for governor? It's no secret that Jay Inslee has been reluctant to reopen schools and businesses, and Washington State is still in phase 2. With a lot of parents, teachers, students, and business owners ready to move forward, does this increase Lauren Culp's chance of winning this year? Thanks.
Yeah, that'll be interesting to see. I mean, that's Lauren Culp's main campaign platform, really. I mean, he's been going around the state. And for anybody who might not know, I mean, Lauren Culp's the Republican gubernatorial candidate. He has never run for office before. He's a police chief, and actually he's the only police officer in a small town called Republic in Ferry County. The town's like population 1,100. But Lauren Culp also used to live on the west side of the state, ran a business over here for many years, and he's become really popular among a lot of conservatives for his stance against enforcing this gun control initiative that voters passed a few years ago. And when the pandemic hit, that became kind of his main issue, and the main issue for a lot of Republicans. He's been going around holding a lot of rallies, doesn't really believe in wearing masks, or at least doesn't believe in the mandate. So I would say that so far, I mean, clearly he's going to attract any people, maybe perhaps regardless of political party, if they think that these restrictions are unjust somehow, or they don't want to follow them. So far, all the polls I've seen suggest that a majority, in fact, a pretty solid majority of people or voters in Washington State, generally speaking, back what the governor's been doing. I'm sure we're all tired of it. I'm tired of it, but so far, at least in the polls, it hasn't shown up that this is going to be a winning issue. But of course, in 2016, we saw some of the polling in swing states was questionable. So I'm reluctant to just predict the outcome, but I think that so far it looks like he's got an uphill battle. And a Republican hasn't won or been elected governor here since 1980.
All right, Nellie from Lake Washington High School, go ahead with your question.
Hi, so my question is that following the BLM protests, especially like those in Seattle, what has been the impact and the predicted involvement of Washington teens in the upcoming election?
Thanks. Was that sort of a question about the youth vote, essentially, and people maybe who were involved one way or the other in these protests, sounds like? Yeah. Well, obviously in Seattle, it's mainly, not just Seattle. I mean, you've seen these protests everywhere, small towns, big towns, Spokane, up in Snohomish County, and the big ones in Seattle. And it is definitely, I have seen, candidates have to take, positions on issues like what do you want to do about the way policing works, generally, or in Seattle specifically, and more broadly, what kind of a society have we built? Is it equitable? Do we need to do more? Do we need to face our own racism, for example? So you've seen candidates speak to that issue. And there are some candidates, like Mr. Culp, who we mentioned before. I interviewed him. He's a police officer. He doesn't believe there is any systemic racism in policing. Jay Inslee and the Democratic Party in general, I would say, is much more pushing reform in the police departments. There's wide variations of how broad that goes. You got people in Seattle talking about basically abolishing the police or starting over, but there's a lot of people who are talking about more gradual reforms, like making death investigations more independent. As far as the impact on the election and the youth vote, like I said before, or maybe it's a corollary to what I said before, the youth vote comes out more in the presidential elections already. And so I think that there are people who will be motivated by that particular issue. And I think there's probably a pretty big contrast there at the top of the ticket between the two presidential candidates, and it goes right down the ticket. I know that some of the people who believe the system is sort of hopelessly corrupt might be tempted not to vote, or might think, yeah, Joe Biden, what is he really going to do? Is it sort of as sweeping as I want? And especially like when he was still running in the Democratic primary, that was a big issue. And there were a lot of progressives who didn't think he was, definitely didn't think he was going to do enough. But I think that once you got a binary choice, more people are going to mark their ballot. And I always like to see, and it'll be interesting to see what the percentage of the younger vote is this year.
All right, our next question comes from College Place High School from Haley.
Hi, I'm Haley Corona, and I'm a junior at College Place High School. And my question is, any suggestions on how I can get my Latino community more involved in elections, as it's hard to find newspapers in Spanish that cover local elections?
That's a good question. I know that the political parties, and I would say, more the Democrats probably than the Republicans in a lot of places have tried to do specific outreach to Latinos or Hispanics. In terms of the media question, that's a good one. I mean, we occasionally, and I would like to see us do this more. For example, we have an education lab that writes articles on schools, and they do translate those sometimes, I believe, into Spanish, and I believe they've done it in possibly some other languages when we feel like it's about a community that we could reach more people with. So as far as getting more people involved, there are organizations that, there's even conservative organizations, and there are Democratic or liberal leaning organizations and nonpartisan organizations that you can find that are dedicated to getting more people registered to vote, for example, or connecting them with the elections in a way so that they seem more relevant. Because I think, for lots of people, sometimes it can be hard to know how this election or casting a ballot is actually going to change your life. So I don't have those organizations all at the top of my head, but they're typically political or non-governmental organizations, like nonprofits that are out there. And I think that would be where I would start, is look for some of those resources, and encourage media too to think about publishing in multiple languages. It's newspapers are not exactly well funded these days, but we are doing some work that's funded by donors and philanthropy, and that's how we've been able to, I think, publish some of those stories that get that kind of reach.
Shira has our next question.
Hi, I was wondering, do you think that you stay nonpartisan in your reporting, and how?
Really good question. I try, and I get it. You should see my inbox. I get it from people, sometimes from both sides on the same story. Sometimes one or the other will be mad. I try to keep myself in a headspace of I want to understand the issue, whatever I'm writing about. I want to understand, what people's best arguments are on both sides. That doesn't mean they're always both factually the same. For example, one might be more, full of it than the other, and you got to try to walk that line of pointing that out, fact checking, without just beating up on one side and letting the other one go. And it's something that I think we struggle with all the time. And again, I just try to, make sure that I'm giving both sides a fair say. I think that for the most part, I succeed in that, but I do get criticized, and it's funny, sometimes on the same story, someone will say I did a hit piece on the Republican, and then a Democrat will email and say I, was too kind to the Republicans or was biased in their favor. And sometimes I want to forward those emails to each other and have them sort it out and tell me where I stand. And of course I have my own opinions, but I basically try to keep those mostly to myself. I do tweet, so I try to control that. But yeah, it's a good question, and there's no like perfect answer. I mean, everything's getting more and more partisan, and I think there's value in media that still gives everybody a fair shake.
I had one more question. How do you think reporting culture can be improved to provide more accurate and non-biased information to the public?
That's a good question. I mean, it's something we're trying to do all the time. We are trying, I think, to, there's a lot of emphasis on, for example, solutions journalism, which is taking a big problem and trying to look at not just pointing out the problem or exposing it, but engaging with communities in, how you would make it better. And I don't know if that gets at the most sort of partisan divides, but it gets at a lot of the biggest problems that we write about. So that's one way. I like personally these fact check organizations that, whether it's Snopes, which is actually locally based, factcheck.org, and there are several others. I think maybe if we had more partnerships with those, with local and regional media organizations, that would be a good thing. We're always sort of scrambling to write about the news and working on investigative stories and things like that. And so stepping back and taking that big picture look can be kind of difficult, but we are, at least at the Seattle Times, I think we're sort of open to that.
Still on the topic of journalism, Haley from Open Window School has our next question.
Hi, my name is Haley Wand. I'm an 8th grader at Open Window School, and it is a pleasure to meet you. My question is, knowing that you report on multiple political issues simultaneously and need to have unbiased opinions, how do your readers respond when you share ideas that do not match their own?
Yeah, that's kind of along the lines of what we were talking about. It varies. Sometimes you get really thoughtful critiques and emails and even phone messages, and people are sometimes surprised. I'll pick up the phone, if I can. Not always, but and sometimes you can tell it's somebody who was about ready to let you have it, and just wanted to just leave you a nasty voice message, and they're really surprised when you answer the phone, and they realize you're a human being, and so sometimes you can have a better conversation, and sometimes they'll still be mad, or sometimes there'll still be people who are screaming profanities or whatever, and I don't, if they're going to do that, I won't really engage with them. I had one guy once call my cell phone about 14 times in a row and left about 14 messages. This was about the Seattle Supersonics when I was covering the sort of the trial when they left the city, and he had some opinions. So I picked up one of those calls and I just kind of laughed because he was just ranting. But so you do get a lot of abuse, but I try to respond to the people when I have time who are leaving, giving you asking some good questions or saying, why did you report this? Or why didn't you mention this? And I'll oftentimes reply, hey, that's actually a good one. Or maybe you had a point there, and I'll keep it in mind the next time I write about it. Sometimes you just can't, for example, put every bit of detail in a story that you want, or maybe sometimes they found something that you didn't see, because I'm a human being. I don't know everything. So it's really a mix, and I've tried to engage with the people who are worth engaging with and who don't just want to yell.
All right. Well, related to that question, Gavin also has his own thoughts that he'd like to share.
Hi, my name is Gavin Simmons. I am a junior at College Place High School. My question is, let's say you have a new article that you poured your heart and soul into trying to get out the truth, and it's called out as fake. How do you respond?
Good question. The fake news term, boy, hate it. And the sad thing is, like, it's sort of known as being a Donald Trump phrase, but there have been people on the left who've used it too, and in sort of sometimes equally, I don't know, ill-informed fashion. They just didn't like that you focused on something or that you chose to write about something. That term is just, it's clearly used as a way to just dismiss something that you don't agree with. I think most people, if you look at, there have been even studies about psychology and how people form their beliefs. We all like to think that we are intellectual and think about both sides and then arrive at some opinion. But really, most people have an opinion that they've arrived at, whether it's because they were raised that way or their friends all feel the same way about something. Sometimes where you live, and then you look for bits and pieces of information that fit your worldview, and you sort of only consider those. And our fractured media environment hasn't helped that. If you only watch Rachel Maddow or you only watch Sean Hannity, I don't even know how you can have a conversation with each other. So sometimes I just laugh because it's laughable. If people are saying it's fake news and you've said, here it is, we've reported it, I mean, like, here are the facts. You can see what we attributed the information to. And, I do get a kick, I'll say, about, for example, the Trump administration complaining about anonymous sources and saying that everything that's based on any anonymous sources is fake news, when top, senior administration officials give briefings to reporters frequently in DC and demand anonymity for those briefings. So, clearly they don't play by their own set of rules. That said, I think that anonymous sources probably are used too much in certain contexts.
Well, we're getting close to wrapping up here, but our last question comes from Charlotte.
Hi, I'm Charlotte from Open Window School. Knowing that every vote cast is of great importance, what would you recommend Washingtonians do to become informed voters on what's on their ballot, including referendums, initiatives, and candidates? Thank you.
Thanks. Well, I would read Seattle Times, seattletime.com. You can follow me on Twitter at Jim_Brunner. But seriously, I would read, if it's a local race close to home, try to find your local media sources. Newspapers have been kind of declining, but there's usually community newspapers that are covering those local elections. I would say there's a lot of good resources out there, like even the state voter pamphlet. I mean, those are sort of self-serving statements by each candidate, but it's kind of a baseline for people to look at. There's national organizations like Ballotopedia that try to have information on every candidate, no matter where they are. You can go, if you're interested in money in politics, to places like Open Secrets, which does a very good job at tracking where big money goes in all these races. You can learn a lot there. You can also go to the Federal Election Commission or the State Public Disclosure Commission and play around with the data yourself. It can be pretty interesting. So those are some of the resources.
Well, again, Jim, thank you so much for your,
Watch TVW too, they're good.
Thank you. All right, well, thank you again so much for your time today. Any final thoughts and last words that you may have missed?
These are really good questions. I really appreciate it. It's nice to see people who are engaged and interested in politics and journalism, because like I said, some days my inbox isn't super fun to read. So this is a lot more fun than that. And, if you ever want to ask me a question in email, don't hesitate to reach out. I'm on Twitter. I even made one TikTok, but I don't know if I'll do another one, but it's out there somewhere. So thanks a lot. I really enjoyed this. Appreciate it.
All right. Well, thank you again, guys. Thank you so much. And join us again next time on Connect.